But then I got hit with facial paralysis just overnight. And that's when everything changed.
What fuels a multi-passionate life? I'm Jessica Wan, and in this podcast, I interview people who straddle two completely different worlds. I call them ampersands, and we are collectively designing the Ampersand Manifesto. I am so excited to be talking with Heidi Moss Erickson, singer and scientist. Heidi double majored in biology and vocal performance at Oberlin and went on to grad school to study biochemistry with an emphasis in neuroscience. Her postgrad research on telomeres led to a landmark paper in the research journal Cell. For over 20 years, she's had an extensive career as an opera singer and concert soloist with a focus on new music. Heidi teaches vocal physiology at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music and Applied Voice at UC Davis. In 2007, she came down with a rare nerve injury, which resurrected her passion for how the brain controls singing. Her column, Minding the Gap, Connecting Research from Neuroscience to Vocal Pedagogy, will be a regular feature in the Journal of Singing starting September 2022. Heidi, welcome to the show.
Hi, Jessica. Thank you so much for having me and reconnecting it in this kind of forum. It's just a pleasure. Thank you.
The pleasure is all mine. Heidi, you have been such an inspiration for so many of us classical singers in the San Francisco Bay Area. Not only are you an incredible singer and performer, you've taught so many vocal students about technique, interpretation, and biology. How do you approach teaching voice as both a singer and a scientist?
Oh, this is a great question. Obviously, pedagogy is my passion. And I think what often gets conflated is that if you are a scientist and love anatomy, physiology, terms, that means you teach in a thinky way, or that you sort of impart that interest onto your students. And so I do think that the art of pedagogy is very different than the art of science, and that the science is sort of the informer to guide the pedagogy. So what I think is the most surprising comment I get is that you make me a less thinky singer. You make it more fun. And so that is what I think the ultimate goal is. You know, there's this wonderful hierarchy that we all start with unconscious incompetence, and then we segue through to, unconscious competence and, unconscious incompetence and whatnot, and that always sort of flips back and forth, but the ultimate goal is the unconscious competence. And so I think that's what I try to target, that the science is a tool for me, and if students are interested in it, I'm happy to share the why, but in the moment, that's when you sing, it's the kind of art where that kind of thinking can actually be inhibitory.
I totally get that. And having voice teachers along the way kind of be like, oh, you're overthinking it, right?
Right. I got that a lot too. It sort of took me my own journey to uncouple those two processes, because I almost thought, oh, it's great. I can think about these things. I know how the muscles work, but it took the sort of neuroscience element to make me realize that, there's a difference between what to practice and how to perform, but also how we practice is really the art of pedagogy. And it's such a complex system, and our attention spans are such that we have to only think of one thing at a time. And singing, as you know, as being a wonderful singer yourself, is that there's so many things we can choose to think about. So the what to think about when is the holy grail of the art. And that's sort of what I am driven to sort of decipher.
I love this. Let's hear Heidi sing. This is an excerpt of the song Nähe des Geliebten by Henry Morricone, American composer who sadly just passed away in 2022. The title translated to English is Nearness of the Beloved. So you mention on your website that you grew up in a family that was very heavy in the medical and academic sciences. How did your upbringing shape how you thought about what a career should look like?
I love my family. We are all very close. I'm the youngest of 6, so not only do I have that older sibling imposter syndrome, they're all extremely successful in the sciences. And so I think it became that was normal, that a career in medicine or biology is sort of the unspoken expectation. And they didn't force it on me, but I did feel that expectation. And I think that drove me to pursue it at the higher level I did. I believe that in being curious and being a seeker. So everything I did, I was interested in. But I think more my personality was always the arts. It was just that the culture was that's a hobby. So it took a lot of self-reflection to be able to say, my identity is a singer. I still sometimes struggle with air quotes, what am I kind of thing. But that upbringing, definitely the dinner table conversation was always something medical or something scientific. That was sort of the norm.
How have your thoughts about career and success changed over time?
It's still a work in progress. I admit wholeheartedly that I have imposter syndrome because I did not pursue that PhD. I had the opportunity. I actually got into medical school. I started a little bit, hated it. When I was doing research at Rockefeller, my wonderful mentor, Tizia DeLonga, said, you could finish this up in 2 years, since I've been in the lab by 5 at that point. But at the time, if I pursued that, all the lessons and coachings I was taking on the other side of town at Juilliard, I would have had to give up because, number one, you can't afford it as a graduate student. I could afford it as a staff research scientist. And number two, my time would have been taken away. I think this whole time to this day, I've struggled over the fact that I don't have a doctorate, just because there was so much value on the degree in my family. But I do think that if I had pursued one or the other, whether it's vocal pedagogy, voice science, vocal performance, or neuroscience or molecular biology, I wouldn't have been able to have this final result, which is the fusion of the two.
So I am picturing you in 1999, which was a huge year for you.
Yes.
Just like running across New York City. This was the year that your paper on telomeres was published in the science journal Cell, and it also landed on the front page of the New York Times. And you won the New York District Metropolitan Opera National Council auditions. It's a big deal.
Yeah, it was the New York. I made it to the finals, but I tanked there. But I at least won the New York division, which was a huge deal at the time.
It's a huge deal. Thinking back to that time, how were you balancing your ampersand lifestyle? How were you straddling these two worlds at such a high level?
I was very lucky to have a mentor in Dr. Tizia DeLonga, female scientist, which is also incredible at that level. The telomere field was highly female. The Nobel Prize winner in 2009 were two colleagues, Carol Greider and Liz Blackburn, whom I know from conferences, and they won the Nobel. So it was just one of those fields where there was this culture of empathy, and there was a grind, but at the same time, an embracing of individuality. And I worked very hard. I mean, I probably put in 60, 70 hours a week in the lab. We had our housing right on campus and so forth and so on. But she would let me leave in the middle of the day to go take a lesson. So I'd hop on the crosstown bus, the M66 for people who live in Manhattan. I would be 2 or 3 hours out in the middle of the day taking my lessons and coachings and come back and then stay late. So that was one feature that I think any other job I couldn't do, right, is to have this freedom to break up my day and practice or take lessons. And the second part of it is I was fortunate there was a young artist program called Di Capo Opera. Michael Capasso was the head of City Opera for a while, too. And that little community of singers was sort of my fun time after the lab. And that was an education in and of itself. People talk about work-life balance, and for me, it was life. I loved everything I was doing, and so nothing felt like work and nothing felt like off of work. It all felt like one mushy thing of awesomeness. So it was a very lucky time that I could do all of those things, but it wasn't juggling. It was just a wonderful way to live. And I think not having a mentor like that, I would have been able to do it. So I do credit her for so much. So she was just a mentor beyond mentors.
You mentioned that Dr. DeLange encouraged everyone in the lab to read papers from other fields of science. It sounds like you developed a well-versed repertoire of science, bringing it back to musical terms.
1,000%. I mean, that's what makes good musicians, right? Is being able to sort of look at a period of time or a genre and be able to create, see the palette within that. And I think science has a lot of that as well, is that there's a lot of commonalities in science. Molecular biology and biochemistry are universal, whether you're studying immunology or neuroscience, those fundamental principles. And I was a micro girl, so the micro is very, very universal, sort of like physics, right? It's like atoms, molecules, but these kinds of, whether it's genetics or signal transduction or cellular biology, those are all common throughout all of the systems. So it's just putting it into a different system in a way, and then building out from that, the micro to the macro. And singing is very similar.
Oh, I love how you are making all these connections. So walk us through that time between 1999 till 2007. What did your life look like?
My life after I won the Met changed dramatically in the sense that I got offered some singing jobs, which I never even fathomed. I took a leave of absence from the lab to sing in Italy, and then I had gotten a job with Michael Ching with Opera Memphis. And so that just sort of gave me the taste of professional singing life. And I just said, wow, if this is happening, that would be great. And at the time, my husband got a job at UCSF. And so we had to move. We had to leave New York. My lab life that I had known for almost 10 years at that point changed. And so one of the things was, okay, we come out to San Francisco and I'm going to be trying the singing thing. And it sort of flooded from there. I also had my first daughter and then got pregnant with my second daughter. So there were all these kinds of personal things that set the stage for me to pursue singing at a level I wasn't able to do before. And the work started coming. And even when I had my first daughter, I remember, sorry if this is TMI, but, like having her backstage and being able to breastfeed and go back on stage. I was doing abduction from the Seraglio at that point. So it was very, Victorian garb, your boobs are already out to here. So, so that was great. I even had a contract at SFO that was waiting, but then I got hit with facial paralysis just overnight. And that's when everything changed in that arena for sure.
Yeah. So you call this a cranial nerve injury. And I know Bell's palsy is what folks know about it. And this could have ended your singing career.
Yes. People talk about Bell's palsy. It's a very generic diagnosis. Justin Bieber, I don't know if people heard in the news that Justin Bieber got it. And the thing, when you do first get it, I was 8 months pregnant. They tell you when you walk to the ER, you'll be fine in 3 months. The norm is 85% recover 100%. And it's the seventh cranial nerve that gets damaged in Bell's palsy. And all your facial muscles of expression, not sensation, so you still feel everything. It's just the movement, as well as some other muscles related to your larynx. Your digastric and stylohyoid are affected, which are supraglottal muscles for those who like that kind of geekery. They elevate the larynx. And there's a couple others, salivary glands, tear ducts, things like that. So they treat it as a nothing diagnosis where you'll get better, because most cases do. But what happened was, after 3 months, supposedly, where I would have had improvement, there was no improvement at all. And so that's when, the doctors have that scared look in their face. And then they say, okay, we need an MRI. And they did the MRI, and that's when they showed what's called complete nerve damage. So the nerves, it's like a wire you plug into the wall. It has the conductor part, and then it has the plastic coating around it to protect. So the nerves are like that too. They have the conductive part, the axon, and then they have the myelin sheath, which is like the coating. In most cases, it's just the myelin sheath that sort of gets damaged with that compression. So the nerves are still wired to the same muscle, still can generate electrical activity. They just need to regrow that coating. But in my case, it's, 0.1%, it's very lucky,
Wow.
0.1%, had complete nerve destruction at the site of the origin of the cranial nerve. So that was complete nerve death of all the muscles really high up. And so for about 2 years, I had complete paralysis. And then the nerves do regrow. They regrow slowly, like I think less than 1 millimeter a day. And if you think of the web, of thousands of nerves, you stretch it out. It's a long stretch. So then they regrow without a path. They don't have a path. So that's when the second phase of facial paralysis, which is why the term is a little bit of a misnomer, is what's called synkinesis, which is aberrant contraction of all of those muscles that are innervated. And so the signals that my brain was sending before will send it. So like, for example, I smile and my eye squints, and they're also contracting all the time. So you get something called hypertrophy, where the muscles start getting thicker and thicker. I said it's like having Arnold Schwarzenegger on my face doing, it's like he's pumping me up, so that's what happens, is this just constant contraction. And that's the second phase. And I almost feel like that phase is harder. That's sort of the facial paralysis story.
So when I met you, it was sometime after 2007, and you had been living with this facial paralysis that came on suddenly. You were working as a singer, working as a teacher. You've embraced it. I think your email actually is kind of a reference to Bell's palsy. And I felt like
yes,
it became part of your identity.
Yeah, 1,000%. I joke that, I had a bit of a pity party, but then I actually did have a party. I made everybody come and make masks and things like that. But, I did go through that mourning, because especially as a woman too, it brings into ideas of vanity and self, right? And feeling attractive. And even my daughter would think I was angry. She would say, "Mommy, why are you look angry?" And that started actually the Neuroscience Journal, because you read these papers of the impact of a mother's face on a child, right? And a newborn, because that's where they learn emotional imprinting. And so I was nervous more about my newborn, but in fact, I think it impacted my 2-year-old more, because she witnessed this kind of change. And so she would say, "Why are you angry, Mommy? Why are you?" And I said, "Honey, Mommy's face is broken. I just can't express." As far as singing goes, for 2 years, I didn't open my mouth because speech was hard too. I had a speech impediment and it was too depressing to try to sing. But then a friend of mine, baritone Eugene Brancoviano, he's a Bay Area guy, was sort of pushing me. And one day he came over and he just said, just try. That sort of started the process. And then he had a gig with John Parr, ironically, of Leader Alive, of Deutsche Oper Berlin. And he said, why don't you just sing a couple duets with me? And the funniest thing about that is one duet he wanted to sing was the Papageno Papagena
Yes.
duet. But I couldn't say P. I could not pronounce P. So I said, "Eugene, I can't do that one," because I was pronouncing P. I still remember, my brain remembers, because my lips, even right now, there's no muscle action on that side of my lip. So what did I do? I sat in the mirror and I just thought P over and over and over again and kept trying to do it. And finally I got a sound that resembled P. I think if he hadn't asked for that duet and I hadn't sat and tried to say P, my whole rabbit hole of the neuroscience of singing may not have come to the fore. Who knows? But that was the big lesson in, if I hear it and I want to speak it, it will come if I practice with that audiation step.
Well, thank you, Eugene. And thank you, John Parr. And what an amazing turning point. So you thought P and you were able to vocalize it.
Yes. Yeah. It took practice. Your brain wants to execute a sound and it audiates that sound and it will experiment with options to get that sound, and then once it discovers the option, that becomes reproducible. And that's exactly what singing is. All the motor action happens prior to onset, and that's something that is sometimes hard to conceive of because we're so used to conscious level of things, but so much is going in the unconscious level.
That's Heidi singing Hinüberfällig by Kurt Erickson in her Leader Alive concert in 2014, 7 years after facial paralysis struck. You can hear the full song on SoundCloud. It's performed by Heidi, Kurt, and violist Paul Yarbrough. Along with being a wonderful composer and pianist, Kurt is also Heidi's husband. She said that he's taught her more about creativity than anyone else. Let's take a short break to reflect on this question. Who in your life has taught you about creativity? Outside of hosting this podcast, I coach leaders in the workplace to navigate change, thrive in their roles, and stay true to their values. And I love working with ampersands. If any of this intrigues you, reach out to me at jessicawan.com. JESSICAWAN. Now, back to the show. Your column, which is called Minding the Gap, Connecting Research from Neuroscience to Vocal Pedagogy, will be a regular feature in the Journal of Singing starting this year. What do you hope singers and voice teachers will gain from it?
Singing is a very different instrument than other instruments. I mean, I used to play piano, and I do believe that we need to value singing as an instrument, but we need to train it very differently than other instruments, even in terms of music theory and all the other things that musicians do, because it's a biological and physiological instrument. And not only are we using the musical parts of our brains, we are using the linguistic language parts of our brains. And a lot of times we have to override that to execute. So the teaching part, the pedagogy part, what I hope it'll do is show that we can honor the past and the history of vocal pedagogy, but we really need to embrace new information as it comes, which neuroscience is really the hub of that, because it can inform so much of what we do as singers and make it easier. My hashtag is like making singers better, faster, easier. We've been focused so much on the mechanics of singing. And I made this actually in the article I just submitted for the November-December. I made this analogy to a computer printer. If you were just watching a computer printer and you watch the paper loading in and you listen to the cartridge and then you do the output, you would assume that the loading of the paper is the first step. But what you don't see is the document software, the font choices, the number of pages selected, the size. And all of those things are happening on the computer, and that's what's sending the signal. And so that's the analogy I give for singing. We've been watching the mechanism for so long and thinking that's what we have to do. But if you were to try to print your document holding the cartridge of the printer and manually trying to type, it wouldn't work, right? So it's this upstream complex algorithms that tell the mechanism what to do, not the other way around.
You've been a champion of new music for a long time. Your upcoming solo recital on October 2nd with the Leader Alive in San Francisco will feature works by several contemporary classical composers, such as Kurt Erickson, and a premiere by Tariq O'Regan. You mentioned that you learn new music in a very neuroscience-y way of singing. What do you mean by that?
My joke is when I was at Rockefeller University, which is just a magical place to do science, it's small enough and scientifically social enough, if that makes sense, where you meet people from other labs and you're also going to talks from other faculty members. And I remember this professor, Nautenbaum, and because I'm a singer, he worked on songbirds and he worked on the neuroscience of songbirds. But it was before the information that we know now was out. And I just remember going to a talk and being like, what is this about? What do we have in common with songbirds? This is all crazy. I'm all for model organisms, but this just seems nuts. So what happened in the end is there was a postdoc in Nautenbaum's lab around the same time I was there, Dr. Eric Jarvis, who now has his own lab at Rockefeller. And when I was researching when I got facial paralysis of all of these kinds of ideas, his name kept popping up. Indre Viscontis, who's also a neuroscientist in San Francisco, mentioned him. And then I started reading his papers, and it's all based on songbirds. And so I discovered that we're actually more akin to songbirds in our ability to vocalize from a neuroscience perspective than we are from our nearest primate ancestors. So evolution has this way of selecting for features that branch out into very complex phenotypes that look alike and function alike, but are in very different evolutionary lineages. So how I learn new music is through what I call the vocal learning process, which is smaller patterns, chunking, can't do the whole piece, and I'll make what I call a tutor recording of sort of just the melody first, and then I'll just listen to things over and over again. I don't even read as much. I mean, of course, as singers, we have to read a lot of music, but it's solely an auditory process and a repetitive auditory process before I even open my mouth. And I don't sing it until I feel it's imprinted auditorily. That's why I always say get off the page as soon as you can. It's not helpful.
All right. So singers, if you're listening, learn it like a songbird.
Exactly. And I have students who request songbird lessons. I have one student who will only do it that way. She reads music wonderfully. She had such baggage if she saw a certain note or a certain vowel that it would just freeze her. So if she does it songbird style, it doesn't phase her as much.
It seems like a way to get through the brain too, and any blockers there, any sort of doubts. Yeah.
Exactly.
What advice do you have for people who are pursuing or thinking of pursuing an ampersand lifestyle?
The advice I give is trust yourself and always be curious, always be a seeker. I think it's not just in science. I think every field you need to be curious to know more and okay with making mistakes. And sometimes we're so wired to this perfectionist way of being. But I say, like, if a singer says, oh, they don't like it, I'm like, yes. I actually say we have to cheer when something doesn't go right, because that's when your brain makes awareness. And there's studies on this, mistakes and then reflection after a mistake are what brings you to the next level, whether it's a motor skill or a mental skill. So embrace mistakes, be curious, trust yourself.
That's growth. Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think should be in the ampersand manifesto?
There is no such thing as two things that don't have a connection. People used to say to me, science and music, they're so different. And I say, they're identical. It's this technical foundation with a creative overlay that's needed for both. And I think sometimes people think, well, I'm interested in this and I'm interested in this, but they're not related. And I think seeing what's related in everything is where the magic happens. That, I think, is something that's important for ampersands to remember, is that there's always a connection between what they're doing, those two things or three things or four things that they're doing.
Heidi, it's been such a pleasure talking with you today.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure talking with you too. I appreciate you making this kind of identity accessible and validating it and valuing it.
Folks, you can check out Heidi's work at HeidiMossErickson.com. That's HeidiMossErickson.com. If you like this show, hit like, subscribe, and share with your friends and fellow ampersands. I had a chance to reflect on my interview with Heidi, and here are some key takeaways that came up. Heidi's depth of knowledge in both singing and neuroscience truly makes her one of a kind, especially as a teacher. The fusion of the two is what makes her, her, and it builds upon both of her worlds, creating something new and unique that she offers to those around her. Secondly, I am blown away by Heidi's strength and perseverance in the face of adversity. To have rebuilt her singing career and to have literally reawakened the nerves in her face to make that happen is an amazing testament to what is possible. Lastly, I've been thinking a lot about what Heidi said. There's no such thing as two things that don't have a connection. So what is the connection in your own life? Find that connection and lean in. That's where you might find the magic.
Change is hard for people who are rooted in a system like singing. Hopefully, we'll see. I'm hoping the column will at least have people thinking. People may say, oh my gosh, I'm not going to change what I'm doing for this, but maybe if a light bulb goes off here and there, then I've done my job.